Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be talking with you all today about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, which is journalism and how engineering leaders can think like journalists to make better decisions faster. I've been thinking like a journalist for almost as long as I can remember. I got my start in journalism when I was just 15. I was a freshman in high school. And I wrote an article for the school paper about the most important topic I could imagine at that time. It was a 5-star film review of Revenge of the Sith, the Star Wars prequel. And I don't think that my English teacher understood the passion she was unleashing in me when she allowed me to write that story. I went into study journalism in college. I worked professionally as a news editor and reporter for several years after college. And although I can confidently say that my news judgment did get better, my taste in films hasn't changed. I stand by my original work. So that means I am a career switcher. I've been really heartened to see how many of us here have a background that is non-technical. When I became a product engineer and I learned to code, it was a really natural transition for me. A lot of the things that I loved about journalism, writing and editing and working with cross-functional peers, I could still do as a software engineer, but without having to talk to strangers. So I was like, yes, sign me up. So even as I was working in news organizations at the Washington Post and the Atlantic, I still felt like I really had to hide my background as a journalist. But the longer I'm in engineering leadership roles, the more I realize that I actually have an advantage because I have the skills of a journalist. Having the skills of a journalist allows me to assess situations and make decisions decisively under pressure. And you can too. So that's what we're going to be digging into today. I want to start with a show of hands. How many of you really, truly enjoy making decisions when you don't have all of the information? Excellent. All right, you can leave this to the speaker hall, come back in 20 minutes. I do not like making decisions. I certainly do not like making decisions under pressure. It just feels like a thing that I should not have to do. As a human, I think I would ideally be making no decisions ever. But I share this as proof that you can learn to be good under pressure and make good decisions when you don't have all of the information. We sometimes think that this is an innate talent or something you are born with, but it's not. It is a skill that you can cultivate. It's a set of skills. And the problem is, it's very uncomfortable to practice these skills because we have to put ourselves in high-pressure situations. But journalists don't have the luxury of trying to navigate around the news. Their job is not to prevent the news from occurring. That would be silly. A journalist's job is to be able to respond well when the news happens, gather the information they can, and help make sense of things for readers. So we're going to be unpacking today 3 things that journalists do proactively to make good decisions, and then we'll unpack a couple of tactics for actually making good decisions in the moment. Because making good decisions under pressure, what we see is someone who is decisive, who is able to commit to an approach, and what is under the tip of that iceberg often is a wealth of preparation done far in advance to be able to perform well under pressure. So we're going to spend most of our time today talking about the kind of bottom of the iceberg, things we can do in advance to prepare ourselves to perform well under pressure. And then we're going to talk about some tips for actually making those decisions. So the first things reporters do to prepare for making decisions is less of a tactic and more just they accept reality. They accept that breaking news is going to happen and that it's going to happen at the most inconvenient time. And by adopting this mindset, journalists put themselves in the position to be able to respond to the news rather than just react. It's a very subtle difference, reacting versus responding, But when we're reacting, we are acting emotionally, often on instinct or impulsively, and we want to shift into a position where we can respond, which is a much more thoughtful, deliberate action. So I've never met a news reporter who was unprepared for the news to happen at the most inconvenient times, and yet I constantly meet engineering leaders, whether managers or just tech leads, as ICs, who are unprepared for the chaos that they are going to experience in the course of their daily work. So what I want us to do as engineering leaders is accept reality. The mindset we need to adopt, and it is a hard one, is that it is our job as leaders to respond well when disruptions occur. Because disruptions are always going to occur, and that's okay. And it has to be okay for those dumpster fire situations to happen, because if we see them as bad and not okay, then we will only ever experience them as uncomfortable situations that we don't want to be in. And that's not a great position to be able to respond. That leaves us in that reactive state. So I want us to get comfortable with the idea that it's not our job to prevent all disruptions as engineering managers. It is our job to mitigate what we can and to respond well in the situations we can't avoid. So when we think about responding well, a thing that's really challenging in those situations is that it's often not just one decision under pressure. It's often a series of decisions under pressure in quick succession. And so what journalists do to help themselves prepare to be in high-pressure situations is they cultivate multiple modes of working. They adapt how they work and what they do based on what's happening. And this requires different skill sets. So if you get breaking news alerts to your phone, you've probably observed that there are a lot of things that come from the Times or the Post. You're like, that is happening, but it doesn't seem like it's breaking news. There's a lot of news alerts that go out. Because news happens on a spectrum of things we can entirely kind of predict and plan against to really big situations that are totally unexpected. So for example, these are two different breaking news stories from the Times in the past week. We have the Nobel Prizes. That's definitely big news, but the Nobel Prizes are awarded every year. They are awarded in the same categories every year. And so although a journalist might not know who is going to be awarded the prize, they are able to plan to cover that event and plan the questions that they want to ask and the details that they need to include in their story. And they do this so that when the other type of breaking news occurs, things that we cannot plan, we cannot predict, natural disasters, accidents, attacks. We've had a lot of these in our news cycle recently. These are the kind of situations that you can't predict and that a journalist needs to be at her best on deadline in order to do her job well. So journalists cultivate, and this is a massive oversimplification, I apologize, they cultivate multiple modes. Because a journalist doesn't just roll up to work and kick up her feet and be like, hope something happens. Journalists are often working on many stories at once, and a lot of news stories are deeply reported, and I call this assignment mode. Assignment mode is when a reporter is gathering sources, they're focused on asking questions, and creating a news story that tells you kind of a whole picture. And you can contrast that to breaking news mode, where not all of the information is going to be available, and it's a journalist's job to often try to be the first to break a story, to be the first publication to have a story available. So a journalist's job in this case is to report quickly, get key details right, and meet a tight deadline. And so I want us as engineering leaders to think about cultivating two different types of modes for handling our work. The first mode is scale mode. And this is, I think, the classic engineering leadership mode. This is the mode that we're in and we're told to be in, that we need to be setting the vision and focused on process and empowering our directs. And this is a great mode to be in. The problem is it's not super conducive to leading under pressure. And so when I'm in a high pressure situation, I give myself permission to switch into what I call scrappy mode. When I'm scrappy, I make decisions very differently than when I'm in my scale mode. In scale mode, I focus on building consensus, getting buy-in from my team, making sure they feel like they're part of the process. In scrappy mode, that is not what they need. They need me to act decisively, to communicate aggressively. Aggressively didn't fit on the slide, but to communicate aggressively and to really create clarity for them and tell them how we need to proceed. And so what we can do is, before anything ever actually happens, is just think. Set aside some time on your calendar to think about what your modes are. Who are you as a leader when you are at your best and your team is just executing on a day-to-day kind of agile sprint basis? And who do you want to be when you're under pressure? And when we start to think about these things, the skills that we need to practice, we're actually priming our brain to better be able to shift into that mode when those things happen. So, of course, a journalist isn't just kind of like mentally preparing for the news. A journalist is often preparing deeply for the news to occur, planning things ahead of time. You know, like the Washington Post plans for the elections a year in advance. So they are already planning and covering, in some ways, the 2024 presidential elections. And journalists will often even write almost stories ahead of time in order to be able to respond even more quickly and have to figure out fewer things in that moment. So the takeaway here for us as engineering leaders is to prepare for the risks and disruptions we are likely to encounter. This is really easy to do, I found. You just start by asking yourself, what could possibly go wrong? And it turns out there's a lot of things when you think about it. You know, production could go down. You could have major platform instability. Someone could leave your team. Someone could join your team. A new executive could come in and steamroll your roadmap. I'm very anxious. I've never had trouble coming up with things that could go wrong. But if this does not come as naturally to you, I'd really encourage you to investigate running pre-mortems with your team. Pre-mortems are kind of similar to a retro, but the opposite. They happen before you begin on a project or a piece of work, and you ask your team to put themselves in the position of imagining that the project you're about to embark on has catastrophically failed. What went wrong? And the idea is for your team to generate plausible reasons for that failure. And then, based on those reasons that they come up with, you can start to plan for what is likely to occur, what you're likely to encounter, and put a plan into place that you can activate when that situation does arise. When you do this, when you think in this way, trying to say, what is the reason we failed for a thing that hasn't happened yet, you engage your brain in a type of thinking that's called prospective hindsight, which is absolutely an oxymoron, but real. Prospective hindsight, this idea of putting yourself in a position to imagine the future and then look back, it actually makes you 30% more likely, according to research, up to 30% more likely to correctly identify the causes of a failure before that failure occurs. And that is as close as we can come to actually predicting the future. If that's not a superpower, I don't know what is. So far we've looked at everything that's beneath the surface. These are the things that are priming us to be able to respond well under pressure. These things put us in the position to respond rather than react, because when you plan for something in advance, you prime your brain to deal with curveballs. And the better you are equipped to handle any one type of curveball, the better you're actually able to respond to curveballs of any kind. And I think that's really powerful. We don't actually have to know exactly what's going to happen. We just have to be ready for something. And your brain is able to create capacity to respond. Which brings us to the tip of the iceberg, actually making a decision in an environment with a lot of uncertainty. When we are in these situations with a lot of uncertainty, we tend to want to wait until we have more information. That's a human tendency. It's very hard to make decisions in ambiguity. But what I want to encourage us to do when we're thinking like journalists is to remember that more information about what is occurring is not necessarily what matters. So we're going to look at this through the lens of the inverted pyramid, which is a very classic news writing format. It prioritizes starting with the broadest, most essential information, who, what, when, where, why, how, up top in the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, and then brings in more and more specific information as the reader continues through the story. This is a holdover from print journalism, when you might have a story on A1, the front page, that is continued on a separate page in the back half of the section. And the idea is that you couldn't rely on a reader, and you still can't, I suppose, to get to all the way to the end of a story. But in writing this way, you guarantee that someone who only reads maybe even the first sentence of your story walks away with broad context and helps them just get the gist of it, even if they don't finish the story. So here's an example from the New York Times on Sunday about the Louisiana governor's election. Not great. So in the first sentence, we have the thing that is happening. This is the essential context. There was a governor's race and someone was elected. And then as we continue through the story, even just these first 3 paragraphs, we can see that the writer gradually adds more context. So in the second paragraph, we see Mr. Landry is a brash conservative. This was a jungle primary, which is unusual and interesting. And we get more information also about the former governor, the outgoing governor. And then finally, in the third paragraph, we actually get to what's really important. And this is not actually information about the election itself, about what happened. This is information that's more specific. It's about what this means for Louisiana. And so as we dig deeper and read deeper into this story, which actually did go on beyond 3 paragraphs, there was much more, but these first 3 were a perfect illustration of moving from the thing that's happening to why it matters. So I want us to apply a similar kind of thinking as engineers when we are in uncertain situations. When we want to make decisions in an engineering context, we need to look beyond exactly the thing that is happening and get more information. Because when something happens, when we're in an uncertain environment, the thing that we are most used to kind of evaluating and trying to get information is about what's happening. And a lot of times, it is not possible to get more information about what's happening as much as we'd like it. And so what happens is that we spin our wheels in this state without a lot of context, brainstorming and generating possible approaches. And then we hesitate to commit because we're afraid of being wrong, which then delays our ability to make a decision and heightens the impact of being wrong. Fun. And what happens is that instead of picking an approach, we go with the panic silently and wait option. And what you'll notice is that this is actually a choice. When we do not commit to making a decision and taking approach, and we say, actually, I'm going to wait for more information, that is its own choice. And so I want to encourage us to not choose this panic silently option, but start to unblock ourselves by layering in additional context, additional information that we likely already have to help us narrow down our options. So, inverted pyramid, couldn't leave it behind. The event context is what we're most familiar with evaluating. That's what's happening. But if we keep reading into the situation, we can start to layer in additional context that tell us additional information that can help us narrow down the options here. So we want to layer in context about our team. Who's on our team? What are their skills? And in doing this, we start to answer the question, what else do we know? And this is really powerful because it can help us start to move from possible options, too many, panic, to feasible options in the context of everything we know. And so there are a lot of questions we can ask ourselves to gain more information. And when you do this, you can evaluate your approaches based on the deeper context of what matters. And you may have several good options, because oftentimes there isn't one right approach or one right decision. The right decision is often the one you create. And so when you do this type of thinking, you layer in the team context, who's on your team, their skill sets. You layer in the organizational context, your business goals, the metrics that matter, the economic climate. These start to help narrow down the actual feasible approaches that you could take. The final context that I think we try to just pretend isn't there a lot of times in decision making is a personal context. It's you. What are your obligations? What matters to you? Are you burned out? What outcome do you want? What are you able to sustain? This is an important context for us to consider in all of our decisions, because if we don't, that road leads to burnout. I have been down that road. I am telling you, don't go that way. We want to be including ourselves in the decisions we're making because we're affected by those decisions. And so when you think like this, you may end up with a short list of options, and all of these options you can be confident are feasible and good. And you know that because you've evaluated the core contexts that really matter in a situation. It's not about what's happening, it's about the context in which you're operating. And if you can identify what matters to the team and the organization and yourself, you can confidently choose any one of the options that you're left with because they're all informed by the deeper context. At the end of the day, I do want us to also remember it's totally okay to be wrong. We can only ever make the best decision we can with the information we have. And if we make decisions more quickly under pressure, we can reduce the impact of being wrong and allow ourselves the freedom to course correct if needed. When we commit early, we can monitor those key contexts, all of these things. We can keep an eye on them as the situation progresses. As we get more information, we can start to revisit our decision and say, was that right? Do I need to make a correction? Because ultimately, the faster we're able to decide, the more effective we can be as leaders in guiding what our team needs to do. And again, when we commit early, the stakes are also much lower. That's a key difference between journalists and engineers. Ultimately, our stakes are lower. We make websites. And they are very big and important websites so often, but it is okay to be wrong if you can just course correct. So when it comes to operationalizing this, I want us to walk away with kind of 4 key takeaways. The first, is just accept reality, that disruptions are going to occur, and that's okay. And once we do that, we can start to identify proactively our scale mode and our scrappy mode, and think about who we want to be when we're under pressure, and identify the courses of action that we're going to take. We're going to prepare for our team's most likely disruptions. If you take one thing away, please let it be premortems. I love premortems. Prepare for your team's most likely disruptions so that you're able to respond well when those disruptions occur. and then use the inverted pyramid to help yourself get more information and narrow down your decisions in the moment. Thanks so much for having me today. If you want to chat more about journalism, leadership decisions, or the Star Wars prequels, you can find me at office hours after the break. Thank you.